Hi, I'm Jeremy Knindike, and you're listening to Forced from Home, a podcast about global displacement. The vice president of Equatorial Guinea owns a fleet of supercars. He collects luxury watches. He has his own personal museum of Michael Jackson memorabilia. Meanwhile, the people in his country are struggling to put food on the table. Oh, and I forgot to mention, he is also the son of the country's president. So why did this supercar-owning son of an African strongman invite Stephen Miller from the Trump White House to come visit his country? Well, here's a hint. It has to do with deportations and the dirty deals that the Trump administration is cutting with corrupt regimes all over the world. These agreements have resulted in the forcible deportation of thousands of people, including many people who had legal protection from deportation in the United States, to countries where they have no ties and where they have sometimes been subject to detention, abuse, and eventually deportation to the countries from which they had originally fled. And again, these are people who had secured legal protections in the United States from being sent back to their home countries in the first place. The cruelty of these bargains is very much by design. They are one of the Trump administration's most coercive tools for instilling fear in migrants, for depriving them of due process under U.S. law, and ultimately seeking to deter anyone, no matter what they are fleeing, from seeking refuge in the United States. Further, these deportation agreements really epitomize a transactional and often corrupting foreign policy where the U.S. government is quite happy to engage directly and legitimize quite corrupt pariah governments if they will do the bidding of the U.S. Here at Refugees International, we have been loudly critical of this assault on refugee protection in the United States and the way it is undermining refugee protection globally. No one should be disappeared into a sort of third country deportation gulag. Together with our colleagues at Human Rights First, we have launched Third Country Deportation Watch, a project that unveils the realities of these shadowy deals, exposing the details of where people are being sent, how they are being treated and sometimes mistreated when they are transferred there, the conditions in the countries where they are going, and some of the litigation efforts trying to push back on these arrangements. That tool, thirdcountrydeportationwatch.org, is now the definitive global resource for documenting, understanding, and challenging those arrangements wherever they are emerging. So today I'm sitting down with two experts who will help us unpack these deals that the Trump administration is making with governments around the world, including the highly corrupt government of Equatorial Guinea, and what that means for the individuals who are being arbitrarily deported and facing major safety risks. And stay tuned after that for a short testimonial from a woman named Khadija, who is among the thousands of people who've been personally affected by this policy and whose case we discuss a bit during the episode. And the programming note, we recorded this interview when our group was calling in from multiple countries, and so the audio at times is a little bit garbled, and we apologize for that, but it is the nature of the work. And hang on at the end for the news roundup, and we will cover a couple of other major headlines. I want to welcome my colleague Yael Schacher and our friend Tutu Alicante to the show today. Dr. Yael Schacher is the Director for Americas and Europe here at Refugees International. She's an expert in the history of U.S. immigration and asylum policy, and she leads our work on asylum advocacy in the U.S. and in the Americas, and has been involved in many litigation efforts involving asylum seekers and refugees here in the U.S. and humanitarian parole programs. So, importantly, for this episode, she helps lead our Third Country Deportation Watch initiative, which we undertake jointly with our partners at Human Rights First, which is working to uncover and expose the Trump administration's forced transfer of people from the United States to third countries where they have no ties, often no language, no job opportunities, and no legal rights and no legal status. So we're really excited to talk with her about the project today. Yael, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And we're also joined by Tutu Alicante, the founder of Equatorial Guinea Justice, the only human rights organization exclusively devoted to protecting the rights and dignity of people from Equatorial Guinea. He has worked as a legal consultant with international NGOs. He has promoted accountability and transparency in Equatorial Guinea. He is a lawyer by training and has worked as an attorney representing migrant farm workers in the U.S. in addition to his advocacy. Tutu, it's likewise a real privilege to have you join us today.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Happy to be here.
We're talking today about third country deportations. Yael, there have been some headlines about this since the Trump administration took office, about the U.S. deporting people to, for lack of a better word, effectively random countries that they have no connection to and places where they've never lived, don't speak the language, don't have work opportunities, don't have family, and importantly, countries they never asked to be sent to. You've done remarkable work uncovering the administration's practices here. Help us understand the basics of what's going on and what is the administration doing and how is this operation working?
Yeah, so I covered a deal between the United States and Guatemala to share responsibility for asylum seekers back in the first Trump administration. But it was very clear almost as soon as President Trump came to office that this administration was going to do something quite different and that these third country deportation deals were going to be part of an important part of a sort of larger enforcement and deportation effort that was going to be much bigger than that undertaken before. And that was very clear as soon as Secretary Rubio in February 2025 did a trip down to Latin America, basically signing and making agreements with every country he visited and stopped in. And it was immediately followed by flights carrying Iranian, Afghans, Armenians seeking asylum at the U.S. border to Panama and Costa Rica immediately. And it was still unclear if there was an agreement, if this was a unilateral policy. There was a lot going on. Then there came the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, completely unprecedented, to send Venezuelans to El Salvador at CCOT. And it was very clear that the Trump administration was trying to portray Venezuelans as criminals in a way that they were not. Subsequently, we have learned that almost none of the Venezuelans sent to this torture prison in El Salvador actually had any criminal record at all. It was really targeting, using the idea that they were criminals to justify sending them. That was crucial. And then, again, if you remember what happened, just laying out the narrative here, the Trump administration did, in the spring of 2025, attempted to send and did a big press conference about sending 8 men who they accused of being violent criminals who their countries would not take them back to South Sudan under an agreement that was made with South Sudan. Now, this was, again, taking the arrangements to Africa, which was, again, very unprecedented. If the U.S. had any arrangements with countries in the past, it would be in our neighborhood in the Americas, which had been used to do enforcement and to work with the Trump administration on stopping people from coming to the U.S.-Mexico border, which had been happening for a long time, especially with Mexico, but also with other partners in the region like Panama and Costa Rica, which even the Biden administration had deal with irregular migration in different ways. And so this was different. And when the Supreme Court essentially sanctioned the sending of people to South Sudan, I got really worried because then it became, this is going to become institutionalized and it's going to spread.
And as it turned out, many of the men sent to South Sudan and later to Eswatini, with which the United States also signed a deal, did have criminal records. But their countries like Mexico and Jamaica would definitely have taken them back. So the idea was to punish and make a spectacle of these men. And that's how this all started.
And I think what is important to say is now the Trump administration has 34 agreements with different countries. It has sent over 19,000 people to different countries. They're ostensibly different types of agreements. There are agreements that are asylum cooperative agreements, which are basically trying to get rid of the backlog of asylum claims in the U.S. immigration courts by people who have come to the United States in the last 5 or 6 years and have ongoing proceedings in immigration courts for their cases. Basically, the Trump administration is having immigration judges say, you know what, we're not going to hear your case on the merits. We don't care all the evidence you've submitted. Forget it. We're going to send you to Uganda or Honduras to seek asylum there. That's the plan. And part of it's just rid these asylum cases basically from the courts. Many more people have had their cases terminated than actually being sent. So this shows that the agreements are also about limiting due process rights of asylum seekers. And then the last thing is that there's another type of agreements, which is just sending people to third countries where they ostensibly stay temporarily and then are repatriated or sent to their home countries. These are just transfer agreements, temporary agreements. And a lot of the people being targeted for these agreements have actually won protection in the United States, protection called withholding of removal. They've been found to be refugees in the United States and unable to be sent to their home countries. So the Trump administration is then targeting them to be sent to these other countries. The problem being that if those third countries aren't safe for them, or if it's only a temporary place for them to stay, they're eventually going to be sent back to the countries from which they fled.
So this is sort of a way to short circuit some of those protections in U.S. law against people being, the term in international law is refoulement, but being sent back forcibly to a place where they are unsafe. So the U.S. is inserting a third country into the middle of that so that they're not being directly sent home by the U.S. and thus violating U.S. and international law. One of the countries that has taken deportees under this arrangement is Equatorial Guinea. Tutu, you're from Equatorial Guinea. You're very familiar with the political landscape there. It is famously one of the most corrupt regimes in the world. The U.S. arrangement appears to have been negotiated between the State Department and the vice president of Equatorial Guinea, who also happens to be the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea. You might tell us in a little bit about his car collection, which is apparently pretty snazzy. He had been barred from traveling to the U.S. due to his level of corruption, and the Trump administration actually lifted his travel ban to the United States as part of the negotiations over this deal. Take us into the political context in Equatorial Guinea, and what kind of government is the U.S. government signing this arrangement with, and what is the political backdrop that refugees deported to Equatorial Guinea are being dropped into?
Many of your listeners will be listening to you talking about Equatorial Guinea, and they might imagine a nation with judiciary and a unit and journalists and all these things that in reality, when you're talking about Equatorial Guinea, you have to think of a space where none of those things exist, right? It's an independent judiciary. The legislative branch in Equatorial Guinea, first of all, people should know that it's a country with the longest serving head of state in the world. Jimmy Carter was president when President Obiang came to power. So think about that, right? And then you don't have an independent press, media, and journalists. Civil society operates on immense constraints. There is no system to accommodate the people that this Trump administration is sending there, right? So this is when this private Guinea as a mafia state, right? Absolute authoritarian kleptocracy, meaning that the presidential family has turned this country into a bank account for what they want, right? So that is the system. There was a time in which if you go back to the State Department reports, country reports, and you look back through the years, you see that the government of the United States knows exactly the nature of this government that does not respect human rights, does not respect the rule of law. There is no transparency, no mechanisms for accountability outside in that context, right? And this is where the U.S. government, this current administration, has decided to send vulnerable people who, as Yael rightly points out, many already been granted withholding of removal, right? These are people who, many of them also had pending cases, right? So you take people who are in a very vulnerable position, so what they're escaping, running away from in Eritrea or Somalia or other places. So this is the context that I want people to have in mind when thinking about Equatorial Guinea.
And I think the point on the legal system, or the lack of a functioning legal system and the lack of asylum procedures and refugee procedures, is really important, because the people who are being sent to Equatorial Guinea are people who, many of whom had some sort of withholding of removal claim in the United States, had refugee protections when they were in the United States, and are now being very explicitly sent to a state that does not have those. And the administration's argument here is, yeah, even if these people need protection, even if they can't be sent to their home state, they don't have to get that protection in the United States. They could get it somewhere else. And the somewhere else in this case is a place where those protections don't actually exist, nor does a legal system that could even uphold those protections exist. And I think that's kind of emblematic of what we're seeing across many of the countries where the U.S. is sending people. A similar situation in South Sudan, Central African Republic. These are not places where refugees would be able to get reliable and consistent protection. Yael, turning back to you. So by the work that you've been doing, at least $44 million in taxpayer funding has gone to third country governments. $7.5 million of that went to Equatorial Guinea. So taxpayer money is being spent on this. How are these deals being negotiated? How are these deals being cut? How is the U.S. government persuading these countries to take non-citizens? Why are they doing so?
Yeah, it's a very transactional foreign policy that the Trump administration is engaging with here. And just to take an example, I mentioned South Sudan. I also wanted to mention Eswatini, which early on the Trump administration sent people to, and the memorandum of understanding that was written between the United States with Eswatini. A lot of these agreements are negotiated at the highest political level with little transparency to the Congress or to, frankly, the ministries that actually handle migration in these countries. So they don't know what signs, they have to implement it, and there's very little guidance for what to do when people arrive or are transferred. But so the memorandum of understanding with Eswatini went through months of negotiations. But just before it was finalized, the United States had imposed a tariff on Eswatini's exports. It had cut humanitarian assistance to Eswatini. And then basically the Trump administration promised Eswatini $5.1 million for taking third country nationals, the money of which was then used basically to keep them imprisoned in a maximum security prison in Eswatini, which is notorious for human rights violations. It's also important to note that the money was deposited directly with the Minister of Economic Planning, so it's very hard to understand if all of the money, the $5.1 million, is actually how it's actually being used, exactly how. Again, to your point, it's basically the Trump administration threatens or uses a stick against other countries, either visa sanctions, economic sanctions, tariffs, and offers these deportation deals for them to do as an alternative. And in many cases, there's also a geopolitical consideration where the countries who are making deals with the United States, these third country deportation deals, are eager for U.S. geopolitical support for some reason. So this definitely happened with the deal with the Democratic Republic of Congo. So the U.S. Earlier on in the Trump administration signed a third country deportation agreement with Rwanda. Then more recently, the Trump administration signed an agreement with the Democratic Republic of Congo, and this was indicative of basically the U.S. shifting sides in which country it was supporting, which government it was supporting regarding the conflict in eastern Congo, which the Trump administration is ostensibly mediating between the two governments. So there's a lot of reasons that other countries accept these deals, and much of it has to do with the economic relationship with the United States and the geopolitical interests of those governments. Take the South Sudanese government, for example. It gave the U.S. a list of demands in order to make the third country deportation deal. And I think this list is indicative of and put in writing what many other countries have not given us, in writing, but it's basically the same idea. South Sudan asked the United States on this list, can you please lift the sanctions on this individual politician in our government? Can you please make sure that your visa policy for our citizens, South Sudanese citizens, is not restricted and they can travel more freely to the United States? Can you please do some direct foreign investments in particular industries in South Sudan? So there are very particular sort of demands made by South Sudan in exchange for this deportation agreement. I think that is basically what is happening with most countries. We don't have it as explicitly in writing, but the same kind of thing is going on. I certainly think with the DRC and the Central African Republic, there's definitely been something very similar, asking the United States for investments in mining, for economic investments, and security investments by the United States. There is also some health-related aid. The United States has basically, as you know very well, Jeremy, limited its humanitarian aid all over the world to different countries, but it has signed some agreements with certain African countries to provide especially public health aid. This is true with Uganda. This is true with the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so there are all these kinds of transactional pieces as to why governments would make these agreements with the United States, none of which have to do with assuring the sort of human rights of migrants who are caught in the middle here as barter. These deals are about completely other things.
And many of those countries are also in the midst of negotiating or have negotiated now these large bilateral health agreements. So if they want to keep their population on HIV treatment, they risk potentially putting that in jeopardy, or at least that's the implicit threat behind some of this, is that if you don't sign this agreement with us, it'd be a shame if you had to kick a lot of your population off of antiretrovirals. It'd be a shame if the tariffs on your country got jacked up. So there is a layer of implicit, and I wonder if not explicit in some of these discussions, threat in how the U.S. will use the leverage it has. And as you say, these are negotiated at a very high level. So this is not some sort of technical dialogue. This is something that they are seeing as arguably the highest diplomatic priority of the U.S. government in many of these countries.
Can I add one?
Yeah.
Can I add one thing about this? I just want to mention one other deal that illuminates something that you were talking about too, and also the role of the United Nations a bit. Burundi, the U.S. has a deal with Burundi that initially no transfers have occurred yet, but there's an agreement that has been signed, and initially Burundi refused. But then once the U.S. gave money to the International Organization for Migration for Burundi, the Burundians signed on. And this gets to other issues around how the U.S. is using funding that is really humanitarian in nature, like the health money, but also money for migration and migration protection and migration management that is run by the United Nations that has been shifted to doing and facilitating these deportation deals. And so that the I-1's role, especially in the deal with Burundi, was important, but it's also been important in other arrangements, including with Cameroon and countries in Latin America as well.
And the only countries where the U.S. has made direct contributions to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees this year are countries that have signed this agreement. And it has followed the signing of the agreement. So there's a pretty clear pattern there. Tutu, turning back to Equatorial Guinea, what do you think the government's motive is for signing this deal? They got $7.5 million in the realm of like the corruption that exists in Equatorial Guinea and the money that gets stolen there. $7.5 million. It's not nothing. It's not game-changing money when you've got a garage full of supercars. So what is their motivation here?
That's a great question, Jeremy. What we have is a full agreement. What has U.S. demanded in exchange? What is this $7.5 million big exchanging hands here? So there's still a lot of we haven't seen. There's still a lot of unknowns when it comes to this agreement between the government of Equatorial Guinea and the U.S. But clearly, as you mentioned, Jeremy, $7.5 million is what Theodorin spends in one car, basically. So putting gas in his ads between Genoa and Bahamas, wherever he's going. It is part of the equation, but really it's not the motivating factor here. I strongly believe that, as I mentioned earlier, this is a government that has been on the bad list. So what the vice president now poised to replace his father, poised to become the next president, what they're looking for is international legitimacy, all right? And that is what they gain from a deal like this. They gain legitimacy when the U.S. partners, and we're working closely on migration policy, which we should be clear that what's happening here is not. So they gain that. Locally at home, everybody with respect to the the Pope has come to Equatorial Guinea because Theodorin has asked for it. The U.S. is now in good terms with the government of Equatorial Guinea because Theodorin is, in fact, Theodorin has promised on Instagram to bring Stephen Miller to Equatorial Guinea. So that gives perception to the country that this transfer from or behind father to the son has been basically blessed. And that's what they're looking for. That's what they get from this relationship. Question for me is what the U.S. getting out of this, right? Yael has a to some of this. Now, For me, one of the big things is the cruelty that Yael also described. Why would you send someone to a country when their own country, to Equatorial Guinea, if Ghana already agreed to receive its own citizens, right? So there is no point in sending someone from Cameroon to Equatorial Guinea where you can send them across the border, right? So that cruelty, for lack of a better word, or policy that we as citizens have to find a way to stop that cruelty because it's not immigration policy.
And tell us about the cars.
Yeah. And that's the strange thing about this whole situation, right? Because the U.S., Christopher Lando met with Theodore Rain to negotiate this deal, right? Which, as I'm saying, we haven't seen the full deal, the full agreement. Theodore Rain, the vice president of Equatorial Guinea, is someone that has been indicted and convicted in France, right? For the lavish purchase of a mansion in Paris and about 21 cars. He has had 45 cars in Switzerland and Geneva, which were auctioned off, and he repurchased 13 of those cars. In Brazil, has had 16 watches confiscated in addition to two apartments. So in places, including in the United States, he has had property seized. In the U.S., in California, the U.S. Department of Justice, after investigating and finding out that it was purchased with money that had been laundered into the United States, misusing U.S. banks and U.S. laws to get this money. Strangely, if you go to Equatorial Guinea today, you see the largest collection of Michael Jackson memorabilia in a museum that Theodore Rain has built precisely to hold the gloves and the fedoras and the jackets, etc., right? So this is the country we're talking about. No, compared by the cars, in addition to all these different cars in the US and Switzerland, etc., now you have all these cars in Equatorial Guinea in a warehouse just collecting dust, right? Because there isn't a place in Equatorial Guinea where you can drive Maseratis and Lamborghinis. So from time to time, he would drive it from his palace to the airport and then back because that's all you can do. But otherwise, I think there is a video out there on social media, I believe on TikTok, of a mechanic from Spain that was taken to Equatorial Guinea to service this. And he shows the video of all these cars, basically, as I mentioned, completely full of dust because nobody is driving these cars. And he's there, he just looks at the car and says, okay, all these cars need is to put air in the tires. All these cars need. So basically, cars in a country where most people do not know where their next meal is going to come from. In a country in which hospitals, you still have to bandage your own eyeball, the hospital, in a place where schools are completely dilapidated, or we have the vice president with private jets, with 3 yachts, with all this collection of cars that nobody is using in the country. So this, again, it speaks of the lack of humanity here. For us, there's this concept that I often allude to, and that's the concept of Ubuntu, right? Humanity in others. My humanity is intrinsically bound in your humanity, and vice versa. I am because you are, etc., etc. And what you see when you look at both what's happening in my country and what's happening in the U.S. right now with this removal of Equatorial Guinea, there is essential lack of humanity. There is an essential lack. We've forgotten what human dignity is, right? And we are exchanging human beings between government, $1.5 million, into places where we know that the basic dignity, that humanity is going to be respected, is not going to be protected.
Yeah, this is something that we've been involved with in Costa Rica, of trying to fight for some better conditions for deportees there that do reflect their minimum, their basic humanity, their basic needs, including being released from detention. Costa Rica is, maybe surprisingly, the second largest recipient country of third country deportees from the United States. There is a deal that the government there recently signed with the Trump administration that we have been advocating around and against, along with some partner organizations in Costa Rica. Tell us a little bit about the landscape in Costa Rica and what the reaction from civil society there has looked like.
So a bunch of civil society organizations in Costa Rica, along with us at RI and some international organizations, push for habeas corpus proceedings in Costa Rican court that eventually assure freedom of movement for the people detained who have been sent from the United States, and also put pressure on the Costa Rican government to give them the people transferred there by the United States access to the Costa Rican asylum system, access to temporary humanitarian visas and work permits, basically ensuring that the Costa Rican government would actually treat the people as refugees and asylum seekers rather than just repatriate them to their home countries, which is what the Trump administration wanted. This wasn't sufficient for those who had been separated from family members in the United States and who didn't speak Spanish and didn't feel they could stay in Costa Rica, but it was much, much more helpful than in other countries. And it was showing that these were actually refugees and not undermining protection in the way that the Trump administration was trying to do with these deals, right? And Costa Rica refused to sort of engage in the chain refoulement that sort of is implied, as what Trump administration is basically getting other countries to do with many of the deals. And I should say, now there's another agreement with Costa Rica to send 25 people there a week. And the same situation exists where the Costa Rican government is allowing these individuals access to its asylum system and access to temporary protection. But the problem remains that what this is essentially doing is burden shifting or shifting obligation to protect refugees to Costa Rica, which is what it's done. And again, many of these people have lived in the United States for a long time. They have family members in the United States. So for other reasons beyond actually just access to protection, this is problematic. There was one person sent recently to Costa Rica from Belarus who was clearly a refugee, had participated in political protests, had explained to asylum officers in the United States that he needed to seek asylum, and it was still sent to Costa Rica. So the genuine refugees that come seek protection in the United States are being sent to Costa Rica as part of this arrangement, basically just shifting the obligation to Costa Rica. And I just wanted to say two last things. Pressure was brought on the Costa Rican government, not only in its domestic courts, but also at the UN level, because children were sent to Costa Rica. There was an appeal to the treaty body on the Convention of the Rights of the Child that Costa Rica needed to treat the children sent there, accord them the rights to education and all the other rights that children and medical care, appropriate medical care, that uphold Costa Rica's obligations under that convention. And again, other efforts have been brought before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And I think the reason this is important is because part of the goal, I think, of these deals by the Trump administration is to undermine other countries' adherence to these human rights treaties. And so basically getting other countries to engage in refoulement by repatriating refugees that the U.S. has sent there.
And I think the reason this is important is because part of the goal of these deals by the Trump administration is to undermine other countries' adherence to human rights treaties like the Refugee Convention and like the Convention Against Torture. And so basically the Trump administration is getting other countries to engage in refoulement by repatriating refugees that the U.S. has sent there and potentially sending them back to persecution or to torture and degrading treatment, thus violating the Convention Against Torture.
So the U.S. is trying to enlist more countries in this shared project of weakening global refugee protections, period.
Absolutely. For me, as you know, Jeremy, and Trump went to the United Nations last September and basically said there's no such thing as a refugee. Basically has a State Department saying that people should be accorded temporary protection at best. And all refugees are basically, and all asylum seekers are basically fraudulent. So the true answer is just to repatriate people. The Trump administration's response to how migration and forced displacement should be handled through repatriation. Yeah. And so again, I think this is part of a larger effort by the Trump administration to undermine protection globally. That's why I think it's so important for us to push back, why we created the website chronicling these agreements and trying to expose what's really going on. Because without concerted effort and pushback, I'm worried about the institutionalization of this in the 21st century. Like this being the way countries respond to forced displacement as opposed to the sort of treaties and refugee protections that were created in the 20th.
And that website for our listeners is thirdcountrydeportationwatch.org. We will put a link to that in the show notes. Tutu, you talked earlier about how the government of Equatorial Guinea is not seeking money out of this. They're seeking legitimacy. But yet what Yael is just describing is really an illegitimate approach to international law and international obligations. So what is the kind of legitimacy or the form of that legitimacy that the government of Equatorial Guinea is seeking by doing this deal?
Essentially, the government of Equatorial Guinea is trying to seek four things specifically, right? One, is trying to rebrand its image. For years, for decades, the Equatorial Guinea has been known as a pariah state, as a state in which there's no judiciary, as a state where human rights violations happen, rampant corruption, systemic and systematic corruption, etc. Right? These agreements or this cooperation with the U.S. puts Equatorial Guinea or takes Equatorial Guinea from that pariah state, basically, to a strategic partner of the U.S. Right? And because globally the US is still respected as a rule of law state, as a democratic state, some of that goodwill, some of that good perception that the US still maintains helps rebrand Equatorial Guinea as whole. So that's first. Secondly, internationally helps change the image of Theodorin. As I mentioned earlier, Theodorin is someone that has been held criminally liable in many different places, across Europe, in the United States concretely, right? So this agreement, particularly seeing Theodorin as a person that comes to Washington to negotiate this, helps ensure that internationally he's seen as a political act that one can go sit down with and negotiate deals and sign agreements, etc. So as someone that's poised to replace his father, that is something that Theodorin needs internationally, because he will need to go to G7 countries, to Canada, to UK and France and others, and negotiate agreements so these countries can invest in Equatorial Guinea. Domestically, it also strengthens Theodorin incredibly, right? As I mentioned earlier, having the Pope visit, having these agreements with the US, having these sort of international moments in which Theodorin is portrayed as the face of Equatorial Guinea helps people see him as inevitable inside the country, right? And then for the victims of everything we're talking about here, it reduces any incentive for reform in Equatorial Guinea. Because if Theodorin has the US in his pocket, basically on his side, and has the ability to again start negotiating with all the members of the G8 and in the international community, what is the incentive to then respect human rights or respect independent journalism or ensure that there is independence of the judiciary? Absolutely none, right? I think one last thing, while it is true that the $7.5 million does not matter here, money is an essential part of what Theodorin is trying to get at here. And that's because the Equatorial Guinean government has been seeking to get a loan from the IMF for the longest, because oil is dwindling. The oil economy in Equatorial Guinea is drying up. And Equatorial Guinea has borrowed a lot of money from China. And they, at one point, about 7 years ago, signed an agreement with the IMF, where the IMF was going to invest about $280 million into the country, consistent with Equatorial Guinea passing an anti-corruption law, joining the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, respecting human rights, etc. 3 months into the deal, when the government of Equatorial Guinea failed to meet any of those basic requirements, IMF withdrew the loan. At this point, with the U.S. on your side, the U.S. director at the IMF is a key voice for any loans that gets approved or not approved. So this becomes an opportunity for Equatorial Guinea, which they have already started renegotiating with the IMF, right? But this friendship or whatever with the U.S. becomes a key currency for the EG government to go back to the IMF and other institutions and say, please lend us money. We are a strategic partner to the United States. So in that sense, yes, money is critical, but not the $7.5 million. They're looking for larger amounts of money.
So that's fascinating. And I think it goes back to something Yael talked about earlier, which is the very transactional nature of these agreements. So if Equatorial Guinea wants something from the United States in the form of validation of their attempt to get a loan from the IMF, having the U.S. on board on this is a pretty small price to pay for them to get that big payout.
Correct.
What does that do to political freedoms within Equatorial Guinea?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there is no incentive for Theodorin to guarantee political freedoms in Equatorial Guinea. So we can expect for the future that Theodorin will not only continue some of the terrible, undemocratic policies that his father has had in place, but go even further, right? Right now, we know that Theodorin has about 200 Russians and Belarusians as his private security guard in Equatorial Guinea, right? Ensuring that no one internally can stage a coup, right? So locally or domestically, he already has that buffer of protection in the way of this, I think they're now called the I can't remember what the Russians call them, but there's this group of what replaced what Prigozhin used to run, basically. So they're there locally. Yeah, what replaced the Wagner group, basically, I think 200, 250 of them between Malabo and Bata with Theodorin all around, right? So you already have that sort of protection. And having the U.S. administration on your side, again, see you as a strategic partner, then internationally gives you the possibility of continuing to negotiate diplomatic deals and business deals, etc. We can foresee, or there is no reason for Theodorin to allow democratic elections. There's no reason for him to allow independent press, and there's no reason for him to stop torturing and arbitrarily detaining people in Equatorial Guinea, unfortunately.
And so, in effect, what this U.S. deal is doing for him is giving U.S. government validation to his strongman rule, this guy who has a collection of expensive cars that he can't drive on the roads of the country that he is running, and who is so unsafe from his own people, he needs to surround himself with Russian mercenaries. That's who the U.S. is doing a deal with.
That's correct. That's correct.
Crazy. Last questions to both of you. First, what kind of human impact are you seeing, and what kind of human impact are you worried about with these deals? And in the spirit of this podcast, which is to try and cut through a lot of misinformation, what's one piece of misinformation about this topic that you'd like to debunk?
So in terms of the human impact, I spoke earlier about that philosophy of Ubuntu, right? I think people have to realize that who has been sent to Equatorial Guinea? Let me start with that question. Some of the cases I have often talked about, right? You have someone from Mauritania whose father and grandfather basically were enslaved in Mauritania. This individual manages to escape enslavement, become an advocate against slavery, hereditary slavery in Mauritania, finds a way to make it to the United States, and then you send this individual back to Mauritania where his former owners will be looking for him, right? Also talking about an individual from a Ghanaian village who was a gay man in a village in which being a homosexual is persecuted and can lead to the community killing you, stoning you to death, right? This individual escapes that situation, makes it to the U.S., and the U.S. sends that person back to Equatorial Guinea, knowing very well that Equatorial Guinea will send them back to Ghana, right? Or people who have escaped a sexual abuse, rape in Ethiopia, or political prisoners, they were in and managed to escape that, and you're sending these people back. So in terms of the humanity, if you're an African, they believe in Pan-Africanism, and then you see your president taking people from these situations and sending them back there, it is demoralizing, right? It's demoralizing not just for the victims, it's demoralizing for those of us that care about human rights, human dignity, right? What are some misconceptions? I think there's several. One, some people might believe, all right, these are people that have exhausted all the remedies in the U.S. and therefore have no rights and should not be in the United States, and that's why we're sending them there. Yael mentioned this earlier, and we have discussed this. These are many of these people are people that have had their cases presented to a judge in the U.S., and that judge has determined that based on the story that they have told me, you should not be sent back to Eritrea or to Mauritania or Ghana or wherever, right? And the Trump administration, after holding these individuals for a year, often longer, in a detention facility, send them to a place where they don't speak the language, they don't know anyone, they have no reference, right? You're not sending people from Costa Rica or Honduras to Equatorial Guinea where at least they can understand what police officers are saying. You're sending people, they have no context of where this country is, even though they're in the same continent, right? So that's one misconception. The other one is to assume that the destination doesn't matter, right? And it matters tremendously, right? Yael mentioned earlier about how it used to be disagreements will be worked out with Canada or Mexico, that the U.S. has strong relationship with, and we know what to expect of the judiciary system in Canada or in Mexico, right? But right now, when you send someone to a place, again, and Jeremy, I think because you and I in the U.S., it's incredibly difficult for someone that's not been in a country where there's no judiciary to know what that means, right? It might seem there's no judges, so what? You can find other ways. But it's it's worse than that, Jeremy, to live in a place where you wake up in the morning and you have to live in constant fear because you don't know if you're going to go to bed at night because there is absolutely nothing, no laws, no judges, nothing that protects you. Is a feeling that we should never wish on anyone. To live in that constant fear of your own personal integrity and everything that surrounds you becomes a danger is a feeling that is very difficult to fathom. But that is what Equatorial Guinea is, right? A place where there is the law means absolutely nothing, which is why you have a president that has been there since Jimmy Carter was president, right? It's why torture is an essential part of what this government does to people, to its own people. Right. So we had this individual and being sent to Equatorial Guinea, living in a hotel where the food is terrible. They're constantly getting food ailments, they're getting sick. They're denied access to medical care. They don't have a way of contacting their families. This essentially is psychological torture. Right. So despite all the promises or assurances that the Equatorial Guinea government might have given the U.S. in this notable part, the reality is that these people are psychologically tortured in Equatorial Guinea.
There was already mentioned the situation of gay people who had basically won protection in the United States from return to their home countries. I've been in touch with a woman named Khadija who she's from Ghana. She won protection in the United States as a refugee, but she was sent to Cameroon in January, and she's been living in a facility there for a couple of months now, basically in the kind of psychological torture that Tutu was just describing, because she doesn't have a place to go. She can't stay in Cameroon. She can't go back to Ghana. She's hoping another country might take her in, but an offer has not been forthcoming. And unfortunately, the UN agencies are not really helping with that. That is what we need them to help with. These people in these situations like this, how are they supposed to find protection? How are they supposed to find refuge? And what I'm worried about with these agreements, as I mentioned earlier, the subversion of the entire protection system, where you see the agencies and the organizations, international organizations that are supposed to help precisely in these situations, not being able to help people, and then they're just left in this horrible situation. And if I could just talk about one myth that really bothers me about the way, particularly these agreements are portrayed, they're portrayed as an effort to stop and deter irregular migration to the United States, just reasonable migration management tool, when in fact, what they're really doing is really engaging in a process of remigration, this idea that the United States wants to deport people who are living in the United States already. Some have family ties. They're being separated from their families. So most of the people being subject to these agreements are actually not newcomers, right? They've been here. As Tutu said, they've won protection. Some of them have deep roots here. And yet they're being sent to these countries to just basically in orbit, to not have a place for refuge. And so it's separating families. And so there's an international component to this where it's undermining refugee protection globally. And there's a U.S. component to this, which is an enforcement
many of whom, as you
policy
say,
that's really
are
much
not
bigger than migration deterrence.
In the
And it's
U.S.
fundamentally
on an
about
undocumented
deportation
basis.
of people
They
with
are
roots
in the
United
U.S.
States.
having one protection, having a legitimate legal basis to stay and still being expelled. We will definitely come back to this topic in the future because it is not going away. This kind of exposure of it is really important. So thank you to you both for sharing this today. Yael, thanks for calling in from Villahermosa in Mexico, where you have been. You are on the road actually documenting this sort of thing in real time. And Tutu, thanks both for joining us today and just for your work over so many years to defend human rights and rule of law in Equatorial Guinea.
Thank you, Jeremy. My pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
During our conversation, Yael mentioned the story of a woman named Khadija from Ghana. She had to flee her country due to persecution over her sexual orientation, and she was granted protection as a refugee in the United States. But the Trump administration has now deported her to Cameroon, and she is living there. in a detention facility, unable and fearful to return to her home country. I think it's important to underscore the human toll of the Trump administration's third country deportation agreements on people like Khadija, and the way that these deals are harming her and thousands of others who had sought and often received safety in the United States. Our country is breaking its promise to protect those fleeing danger. So let's hear directly from Khadija about what she has experienced.
Why did I leave my home country? Because I didn't want to die. I didn't want to be killed because of my sexual orientation. I left because I was scared. I left because I didn't want my freedom taken away from me by force. I got to the United States on the 20th of December 2024. My experience was not good at all, as immediately as I crossed the border, I was taken in by Border Patrol and sent to be detained. I didn't mind initially. Being detained meant I had hope of telling my story. I had hope of getting help. It's rather unfortunate that my freedom was taken from me. I was giving a chance to speak, but not a chance to save myself. Well, I stayed in Eloy, Arizona, Phoenix, for a year and a couple of months, fighting my case to win. I got withholding in July, and I was brought to Cameroon mid-January 2026. They just put us in handcuffs like some death row criminals and dragged us to an airport, put us in a plane. I was told that Cameroon was willing to accept us. However, most of the people I came with did not even know where they were going. They had absolute no idea. We arrived in Cameroon in handcuffs. Ever since, I've been in Cameroon. It's not the best living condition because initially when we came here, we were locked in for 2 months straight. They did not allow us to go outside. It was like another detention. The frustration was terrible. We had to go on a hunger strike before we were allowed the privilege to go outside from this place, from this facility, to at least take a walk outside. For me, it has always been a frustration to stay here where I don't know anybody. I don't have anybody, and with my sexual orientation, it's terrifying to even open my mouth to let anybody see through me or get to know the kind of person I am. So I don't go out much. I'm always inside. I only come out when it's necessary. I like to eat, or once in a while, I stretch my legs, but then I get right back inside because, well, I don't want no more problems in my life. My hope is to be safe. My hope is to be free. My hope is to survive.
And now for a roundup of a few other things that we're tracking this week. Let's start with global hunger. The UN released a report last week that is sounding the alarm on a rising number of people facing severe hunger around the world over the coming months. The report identifies places like Somalia, the Sudans, Yemen, and Palestine as the most critical hunger hotspots in terms of the severity and the scale of the need. What's driving this uptick? Well, ongoing conflict in many of those places is a primary driver of the sharp increase in hunger. Conflicts can limit how a community accesses food. It can drive up the prices of food and fuel to reach food markets and makes it harder for humanitarian agencies to provide food aid. But another factor here has been the global economic shocks from the Iran war, which have been inflating the price of fertilizer, reducing likely crop yields later in the year because, frankly, a lot of farmers just cannot afford those higher fertilizer prices, and so supply is going down. And the higher price of fuel is disrupting supply chains and driving up costs across the board. The unprecedented humanitarian funding gaps over the past year are a huge factor, of course, as well, particularly in places like Yemen and Somalia, where the U.S. has completely cut off all food assistance. In 2011, the Obama administration had cut off food aid ahead of what became a declared famine there, and there's a real risk that the Trump administration's cut off amid severe conditions in Somalia could yield another avoidable famine. Head to our website in the show notes to read a couple of our statements from Refugees International about the risks of hunger and humanitarian needs that are deepening in some of these countries, and we will continue to keep a close eye on those hunger trends over the course of the summer. Turning now to the ongoing humanitarian emergency in Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza are continuing to endure immense suffering, and one of the leverage points that the U.S. government has had at its disposal has been the repercussions for U.S. military aid to Israel. There has been an agreement now to halt future military aid to Israel, but interestingly, something else is quietly coming in place of that in the new National Defense Authorization Bill that is being debated by Congress right now. So that bill includes a provision that would reduce public and congressional oversight of the mill-to-mill relationship between the U.S. and Israeli militaries while mandating a significant expansion of military, industrial, and defense technology cooperation between those two militaries. Refugees International recently launched a take action to mobilize constituents from around the country to push members of Congress to remove that provision from the NDAA package. If you're listening to this show, that is probably something that you care quite a lot about. So please head to our Take Action page to let your member of Congress know you would like them to oppose the U.S.-Israel Defense Technology Cooperation Initiative. And you can find the link to that in our show notes. And finally, Elon Musk, in an interesting twist, has spent a good chunk of the past week backpedaling on Twitter about the harm that Doge did with their aid cuts last year. After being challenged by Ro Khanna for having caused countless deaths around the world, Elon wrote back on Twitter, "This is a total lie. All Doge did was require contact with aid recipients to confirm that funds were being used legitimately." And the next day, he doubled down and said, all Doge required was contact information of the recipients to confirm that funding was not fraudulent. No validated medical funding was stopped. Anything that appeared legitimate continued and is now administered by the State Department. If anyone had actually died as a result of Doge, he went on, their names would be worldwide headline news. Well, as it happens, their names have been headline news. Elon is just consciously ignoring it. Let's take a moment to just appreciate how insane this walk back is from Elon. Last year, he bragged about putting USAID through the wood chipper and closing down virtually everything that the agency did. Marco Rubio boasted about cutting more than 80% of USAID's programs. The idea that all Doge was looking for was contact information for a few beneficiaries is absolute horseshit. And frankly, Elon knows it. He had ever asked for that, there would have been hundreds, if not thousands, of humanitarian organizations around the world that would have happily provided that and provided proof of the good that their programs were doing. The problem with Doge is they didn't care. They didn't want that information. They didn't seek that information. They had no interest in that information. They did not want to know about the harm that they were doing. Former USAID official Nick Enrich, who wrote a whole book called Into the Wood Chipper, writes about meetings in which he and other colleagues tried to provide exactly this sort of information to Doge officials to make the case and show the good that their programs were doing and the harm that would result if they were cut. Doge had no interest in it. And Doge ultimately pushed Nick and all other USAID employees out. They forced them out of the government for trying to raise those concerns. But since Elon asked for names, let's give him a few names. A woman named Nyarietna died last year of cholera in South Sudan. after approaching a clinic whose doors had been padlocked for weeks due to the funding cuts. A young 8-year-old girl named Daniela Kalenga, who was a refugee in Uganda and who loved going to school and to church, died of typhoid and malaria after being unable to get treatment for those very treatable diseases because of breakdowns in ambulance services and shortfalls of clinic supplies that normally would have been covered with U.S. government aid funding. Jane Sunday Naboy, the daughter of a woman named Ravina Naboy, were both refugees living in Kenya, and Jane died of severe malnutrition and hunger as a result of cuts to food aid in the refugee camps in Kenya. My colleague from USAID, Atul Gawande, made a documentary film about Ravina and Jane that we will include in the show notes. Those are a few of the names we do know. What also worries me, and what also should worry Elon's soul, frankly, is the names of the many we may never know. The deaths that will be invisible, that will be known only to their family members and not to the wider world, because the programs that serve them and that might have been able to count their loss have all been closed and shut down. So I don't know why Elon is backpedaling now. I think we can assume it's probably not because of a guilty conscience. In any case, we will return to this topic in the coming weeks. Thanks so much for joining us today. Don't forget to subscribe to Forced From Home on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed the episode, consider donating to support our work at refugiesinternational.org or the link in our show notes. For more, follow Refugees International on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and stay tuned for more Forced From Home episodes coming soon.